He thought he had left his past buried forever, until a desperate cry in the wilderness shattered his solitude. 3 years after losing everything, a wounded young woman appeared at his doorstep, and the truth she carried didn't just heal his heart, it threatened to break his entire world apart. Wherever you're watching this story unfold, let us know in the comments below. If you love stories of courage, redemption, and unlikely bonds, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. Now, settle in and experience a tale that proves, even in the wildest places, hope can find a way. The sound that changed my life didn't come with fanfare or warning. It was thin at first, almost swallowed by the wind that rolled down from the high peaks. I might have dismissed it as the call of a hawk or the groan of a dying tree, if not for the way it struck something deep in my chest. There was pain in that sound, raw and human. I had been mending the southern fence line when it reached me, my hands already stiff from the morning frost that clung to every blade of grass like glass splinters. This valley rarely gave me surprises. My days followed the same quiet pattern: rise with the gray light, tend to the cattle, mend what needed mending, eat by the fire, and let the cold silence close in when night fell. That's the life I built here, one without visitors, one without reminders of what I'd left behind. But that cry pulled me upright, hammer dangling useless in my hand. I listened. There it was again, fainter this time, but no less desperate. Something inside me refused to ignore it. I swung into the saddle on Buck, my Mustang who knew every rock and dip of these ridges, and we started toward the sound. The air was sharp, carrying the scents of pine sap and distant snow. Clouds clung to the high cliffs in tattered veils, and the creek ahead roared louder with every step. My mind searched for possibilities. Maybe a hunter with a broken leg, maybe a trapper caught in his own steel. In these mountains, being found by another soul could mean the difference between life and a lonely death. When I reached the stand of lodgepole pines by the water, I saw something wedged against a fallen log midstream. At first, it looked like debris, a bundle of cloth tangled in branches, but then I caught the faint rise and fall of a chest. Without a second thought, I was in the water, the cold punching through my boots like knives. She was young, no more than 20, her skin pale with cold and lips tinged blue. Her long black hair streamed in the current like river grass. Blood had soaked into the torn fabric across her shoulder, the dark stain centered around the jagged shaft of an arrow buried deep in the muscle. I didn't stop to wonder who she was or what had happened. Survival leaves no time for questions. I freed her from the current, lifting her in my arms. She was lighter than I expected, her head lolling against my chest. The heat radiating from her skin told me she was burning with fever despite the icy water. Fever this far gone meant infection, and infection out here meant death, unless someone fought for her. Buck carried us hard over the uneven trail, my mind fixed on the supplies I had at the cabin. Clean bandages, whiskey for the wound, herbs I'd kept from last summer's gathering. I'd patched myself up more than once since coming here, and the war before that had taught me a few things no man should have to learn. The cabin came into view as the sun slid low, its light catching on the ridgepole and the curl of smoke from the chimney. I pushed the door open with my boot, carried her inside, and set her down on the bed, my bed. I had no spare. The cold of the creek was already fading from her clothes, replaced by the heat of a body fighting too hard for its own survival. I cut away the fabric around the wound and saw how deep the arrow had gone. The shaft had been broken short, probably during her escape. Whoever had loosed it had meant to kill her, and nearly had. I stoked the fire higher, poured whiskey into a tin basin, and laid out my knife. The metal glowed dull red after I held it in the flames. There was no gentle way to do this. The arrow came free on the first pull, but the blood came faster. My hands worked without hesitation. Pressure, cloth, more pressure, until the flow slowed to a stubborn seep. I cleaned the wound, packed it with a mash of yarrow and pine sap, then bound it tight. She didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, but steady enough for now. I sat back on the stool beside the bed, staring at her face in the firelight. She wasn't from these hills. Her features marked her as belonging to the people who roamed the valleys and high meadows long before men like me came with our cattle and fences. I didn't know her name. I didn't know who had tried to kill her. But I knew one thing for certain. The moment I pulled her from that creek, my quiet life had ended. The night after I first heard the cry was colder than the mountains had any right to be this time of year. I had banked the fire low, letting it smolder into a dull red core. But even so, the chill seeped in through the gaps of my cabin walls like a thief testing every latch. The wind moved with a peculiar persistence, not a wild gale, not even a proper breeze, just a steady, whispering push, as though the valley itself was trying to speak and could only do so in fragments. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood above me, every sigh of the pines outside, made me raise my head from the pillow and listen. It wasn't fear yet, not quite, but something in me knew that quiet no longer belonged to me alone. The land had its own silence when I'd first come here. The kind you could trust. The kind made by wind, soil, and water alone. But this was a different breed of quiet, a listening quiet. I felt like prey under the gaze of something hidden, patient, and utterly still. I sat up, pulling on my boots without bothering with the laces. The floor was cold as stone under my feet. My rifle leaned in its usual place by the door. I took it without thinking. Old habits. When I stepped out onto the porch, moonlight was pooling in the valley like spilled milk, turning the frost-slick grass into a dull sheet of silver. The barn stood squat and mute to the right. The trees to the north swayed lazily, but I saw no wind strong enough to account for their movement. And then I saw it, just for a moment. A shape slipping between the trunks. Tall. Lean. I might have called it a shadow, except the moon was behind me. I froze. The figure paused, as if aware it had been spotted. Then, without haste, it turned and vanished deeper into the forest, swallowed by darkness. I stayed there far longer than I should have, watching that same patch of trees as if the figure might come back. But nothing stirred. Finally, I forced myself to move, circling the barn, checking the corral, scanning every patch of grass that could hide a man. My breath came in puffs that drifted away into the cold air. When I returned to the porch, I didn't go back inside. Instead, I sat on the steps, rifle across my knees, and waited for the dawn. By morning, frost had taken the ground entirely, crackling under my boots as I went to fetch water from the creek. The sound of it breaking was loud in the cold, too loud. I kept looking over my shoulder as though I expected someone to be right there, following. The days that followed brought no more cries, no more shadows that I could be certain weren't tricks of the moonlight. But the feeling stayed. It worked its way into my bones. I found myself glancing at the tree line more often than at the horizon. On the fifth day, I decided to take a different route into town, one that cut through the southern pass rather than the main trail. It was longer, rougher, and wound its way between cliffs that loomed like watchful sentinels, but something told me I'd find answers there. The pass was narrow enough in places that my horse's flanks brushed the stone. My breath echoed faintly against the walls. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became, until the only sound was the dull rhythm of hooves on rock. That was when I saw the carving. It was etched into the cliff face at shoulder height, old enough that lichen had grown in the grooves. A circle split by a vertical line, flanked by two smaller marks. It was no miner's sign, no rancher's brand. I'd seen something like it before, once years ago when I'd been riding the borderlands where Apache territory bled into the trade routes. I didn't linger. There are places where signs aren't meant to be studied up close. I pressed on, the pass eventually widening into a narrow meadow, hemmed in by forest on all sides. That's when I found it. At first, it looked like the ground had been disturbed by elk or deer. But as I drew closer, I saw the truth. Boot prints, some deep, some barely pressed into the soil, but all recent. And beside them, smaller impressions. Bare feet. The trail led toward the trees. I followed, keeping low, stepping only where the earth was firm. The prints wound their way to a fallen pine, then continued past it to a small clearing where the remains of a fire lay cold and blackened. There were no supplies, no shelter, just the faintest trace of something sweet in the air, like dried sage. And there, beside the ashes, lay a strip of fabric. Worn, frayed at the edges. I knelt, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't cotton, not wool. It was softer, finer, dyed with a deep reddish-brown that had faded to the color of old clay. The weave was tight, deliberate, the kind you didn't see in town markets. I knew then that whoever had been here wasn't passing through. They were watching, waiting. When I returned to my horse, the prints were already gone, swallowed by wind or perhaps covered by someone who didn't want them followed. The ride back to the ranch was uneventful, but my thoughts wouldn't quiet. I kept replaying the sound of that cry, the glimpse of the figure, the sign carved into the rock. They were pieces of something larger, something older than my claim to this land. That night, I lit no fire. I sat in the dark, the rifle resting beside me, listening to the land breathe. The wind shifted sometime after midnight, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong to pine or soil. Smoke. Wood smoke, faint but sharp. Not mine. Not from any of my neighbors either. They were miles off. I stood, straining to hear more. And then, through the dark, it came again. Not a cry this time, but a single note, low and mournful, like the beginning of a song. It rose, lingered, and faded, leaving the night emptier than before. The nights on the frontier carry a silence that weighs on you if you let it. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that swallows every small sound until the faintest rustle in the grass feels like a shout in the darkness. That's how I felt the evening after I found the tracks. Those strange, deliberate prints along the dry edge of the riverbank. I told myself they were nothing. Maybe a lone traveler passing through. Maybe an old trapper too cautious to let himself be seen. But in my bones, I knew better. Tracks like that don't just happen. Someone had been there, and they had been careful to leave no more sign than they intended. I sat by the fire with the kettle hissing softly, my rifle laid across my knees. The flames painted the log walls in restless shadows, and the smell of the pine smoke curled upward like a prayer I wasn't sure who to send to. I tried to read an old, tattered journal I'd found in the cabin when I moved in, a ledger of some kind, with names and tallies that meant nothing to me, but the words kept swimming. My ears were too busy chasing sounds that weren't there. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was all in my head, I heard it again, the faint crunch of weight on dry soil from the dark beyond the cabin door. Slow. Intentional. I stood, every muscle tight, the firelight at my back. The rifle felt heavier than it had a moment before. The sound stopped. I waited. A full minute passed, and the only thing I could hear was the faint hiss of the kettle. Finally, I stepped forward and eased the door open. Moonlight lay thin over the clearing, silvering the grass and catching on the dew-soaked edges of the split-rail fence. Nothing moved. Not a breeze, not a shadow. And then, movement. Not in the clearing, but at the far edge, where the tree leaves swallowed the moonlight. A figure, too far to make out clearly, just a darker shape against the dark. Watching me. We stood like that for what felt like an hour, but could have been no more than a breath. Then the figure turned and vanished into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was no closer to convincing myself it had been nothing. The feeling of being watched clung to me like the damp air. I took to carrying the rifle even inside the cabin. Every time I stepped out to fetch water or check the fence line, I caught myself scanning the tree line first. 3 days passed without another sighting, but the tracks began to appear again, always at the edge of the property, always in places where they could be seen but not easily followed. They were a message. I decided, against every instinct, to follow them. It took the better part of a morning to trace them beyond the clearing. They wound into the forest, where the pines grew so close their boughs wove together into a kind of ceiling. The air was heavy with the scent of resin and damp earth. Every step seemed to echo too loud in my own ears. After half an hour, the trail vanished as if it had been wiped clean. I crouched there, staring at the undisturbed pine needles, knowing full well someone had led me here and then chosen to disappear. That was when I saw it, tied to the low branch of a spruce, a single feather. Black, with the faintest band of white near the tip. It was too deliberate to be an accident. A sign. Or a warning. I didn't touch it. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking low, staining the western sky with a streak of blood-red light. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The door was open. I had shut it before I left. I was certain of it. Rifle up, I stepped inside. The fire was cold. The air felt wrong, stirred, as if someone had only just left. Then I saw it, lying in the center of the table. A strip of cloth, woven with intricate patterns in red and black. Beside it, a small wooden carving of an animal I didn't recognize, something between a wolf and a coyote, but with its head raised as if in mid-howl. It was a gift, or an offering, or a claim. I didn't know which. But I knew then that whoever had been watching me was no aimless wanderer. This was the beginning of something, and I had been chosen for it, whether I liked it or not. That night, the wind came up hard, rattling the shutters and moaning through the chimney. I lay awake, the carving on the table catching the firelight in the corner of my eye. Sleep wouldn't come. Not while I knew someone out there had walked my land, entered my cabin, and left without a trace except for the things they wanted me to find. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I'd seen in the tree-line hadn't been alone. I woke before the sun, not because I wanted to, but because the quiet was wrong. Out here, the dawn always carried certain familiar sounds, the slow groan of wood in the walls as it warmed, the rustle of the breeze through dry grass, the distant yip of a coyote. But that morning, it felt like the whole prairie was holding its breath. The coals in the hearth were still glowing faintly from the night before. I poured what little water I had left into a pot, letting it heat while I dressed and checked my Winchester. My hand lingered on the barrel longer than it should have. In these last days, I developed a habit of it, like a man might clutch a rosary, not for faith, but for reassurance. I stepped outside. The sky was pale, the stars just slipping away. My boots sank into the damp earth where dew had settled in the night. The horizon to the west was painted in bruised purples and dull orange, the kind of colors that warned of a long, dry day ahead. I walked to the edge of the property and scanned the ridges. That's when I saw them. Tiny silhouettes at first, like specks of ink against the rim of the world. They moved in deliberate formation, not fast, not slow, just steady. Too far to make out faces, but close enough that I knew they weren't settlers. The way they rode, the way they sat their saddles, it carried a different kind of pride. Apache. I didn't turn back toward the cabin right away. I stood there, letting the sight settle into me. In the last weeks, I'd felt them around, watching from the tree lines, tracking along the distant bluffs. I'd catch movement in the corner of my vision, and when I'd look, there'd be nothing but wind stirring the brush. But this was different. This was not them hiding. This was them coming. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the water was boiling over. I poured it into my tin mug along with the last pinch of coffee grounds. It was bitter and thin, but it gave me something to hold while I thought. The girl, no, the young woman, I'd taken in still slept on the cot near the far wall. Her breathing was even, her face turned toward the wall, hair spilling across her cheek. I hadn't asked her name, and she hadn't offered it. Every time I thought to, the words stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. I glanced toward her, wondering if she felt it too, that creeping awareness in the air, that sense that time was running out. I didn't wake her. Instead, I stepped outside again, this time carrying the rifle. The sun was higher now, bleeding gold across the plains, and the riders were closer, maybe an hour away if they kept their pace. I thought about what it meant. If they'd wanted me dead, it could have happened already. A bullet from a ridge, a silent arrow from the brush, they'd had their chances. This was something else. But something else wasn't always better. The longer I watched them, the more I realized they weren't riding straight for me. Their path curved wide, taking them toward the river bend. It was a route I knew well. I'd crossed it the night I found her. That night, the moon had been high and the river's surface silver as a blade. I remembered the sound of her voice, raw from fear and cold, and the way she'd clutched her arms around herself like she was trying to hold her soul in place. I still didn't know her full story. I didn't press. Some wounds didn't heal just because someone asked about them. I waited until the riders disappeared behind the far ridge before I went back inside. She was awake now, sitting up, her knees drawn close, eyes fixed on the floor. "They're coming," I said simply. Her head lifted, but she didn't speak. "I don't know if they're coming for you," I continued. "But they're close." For the first time since she'd been here, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, exactly. More like the recognition of an inevitability. She stood, walked to the small table by the window, and picked up the hairbrush I'd given her days ago. She began pulling it through her hair slowly, methodically, as though preparing for something. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but I knew I'd get none answered. The hours passed in slow stretches. I kept to the front porch, rifle across my knees, scanning the horizon. She stayed inside, but I could feel her presence, her quiet movements, the occasional sound of a chair shifting or a cup being set down. By midday, the heat had settled in thick. Cicadas screamed from the tall grass. My shirt stuck to my back, and my throat burned for water I didn't have. It was then I saw them again. Not the same group as before, but 3 riders, closer this time. They weren't coming from the west. They were approaching from the south, keeping to the low ground, using the folds of the land as cover. I raised the rifle, not to fire, but to watch through the sights. 2 men, 1 woman, all dressed in a way that made them blend with the land itself. The woman's hair was braided in long ropes down her back. They stopped maybe 50 yards out. The lead rider, a man with a hawk feather tied into his hair, raised a hand. Not in greeting, more like a signal to hold. I stayed seated, the rifle across my knees. The silence stretched, filled only by the slow creak of leather as the horses shifted their weight. Then the man spoke, his voice carrying clear despite the distance. "She belongs to us." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in my gut. I didn't answer right away. I could feel her standing behind me in the doorway, though I hadn't turned to look. When I finally spoke, my voice felt different in my own ears. "She's not property." The man's expression didn't change. "She is of our people. She returns with us." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I just sat there, the weight of the rifle warm in my hands, the heat pressing down from above, the land holding its breath again. And I knew this was only the beginning. I woke to the sound of wind dragging its fingers through the old poplars behind the barn, the low whistle cutting through the brittle quiet of dawn. The air was colder than the day before, sharper, the kind that slips beneath a coat and lingers on your skin. I stepped outside with the coffee mug warming my hands and felt that the land was holding its breath. The woman hadn't spoken much since our conversation by the stove 2 nights earlier. She moved around the farmhouse like a ghost bound to its beams, fixing small things without being asked, a loose hinge on the pantry door, a draft sneaking through the window by my bed. I'd catch her sometimes staring out toward the tree line, her lips moving faintly as though she were counting or reciting something only she could hear. That morning, she was out in the field early, gathering wood in an old woven basket. I walked over, my boots crunching through the frostbitten grass. She didn't look up when I got close, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped each piece of wood too tightly. "Cold's biting harder today," I said. She nodded without meeting my eyes. "It will get worse before it gets better." Her voice was flat, almost rehearsed. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her posture made me hold back. Instead, I carried the basket for her, and we stacked the wood in silence. When we finished, she wiped her hands on her skirt and finally looked at me. "You've been hearing it too, haven't you?" I frowned. "Hearing what?" She tilted her head toward the wind. "The voices." It would have been easy to dismiss her, maybe even wise, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed strange whispers at night. At first, I blamed the chimney draft or the shifting of the old boards. But now, hearing her say it so plainly, My denial felt brittle. At night, I admitted, sometimes it sounds like people talking under the floorboards. Her eyes sharpened. Not under. Beneath. The ground here doesn't forget. We stood there, the morning quiet pressing in on us. I realized the cold wasn't the only thing making my skin tighten. There was a heaviness to this place, as though the soil itself was holding on to something. Later that day, I decided to walk the far end of the property, where the land sloped down into a narrow gully thick with willows. It wasn't an area I'd paid much attention to before, but the woman's words had lodged themselves in me. The ground there was softer, damp even in the cold, and littered with stones that looked deliberately placed. Some were arranged in lines, others in small circles no bigger than a campfire pit. When I knelt to examine one of the circles, I saw that the stones weren't ordinary. Each had a mark carved into it, not letters I recognized, but symbols with curved lines and sharp edges, worn smooth by time. They felt old in a way that made me uneasy, as if I was trespassing somewhere sacred. I don't know how long I crouched there before I felt it, a faint vibration in the earth beneath my palm. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew steadier, a slow, pulsing rhythm. My breath hitched. It was almost like a heartbeat, deep under the soil. I pulled my hand back quickly, standing up so fast I nearly lost my balance. The vibration stopped. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke, though there was no fire anywhere in sight. By the time I returned to the house, dusk was bleeding across the horizon. The woman was inside, mending a tear in her shawl. I told her where I'd gone and what I'd found. She listened without interrupting, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. When I mentioned the vibration, her hand froze mid-stitch. She looked up slowly, and for the first time, I saw fear in her expression. Real fear, not the guarded caution she usually wore. "You need to stay away from that place," she said quietly. "Why? What is it?" She set the needle down and folded her hands in her lap. "A burial ground. Older than the town, older than any name you'd know. They say those buried there were wronged, and their rest is uneasy." She paused. "And when their voices return, it means the cycle is beginning again." "The cycle of what?" I asked. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "You'll know soon enough." That night, I lay awake in bed, listening. The whispers came again, clearer than ever. They didn't sound angry, not yet, but there was a kind of insistence in them, a rhythm like the pulse I'd felt in the soil. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried an urgency that made sleep impossible. I got up and looked out the window toward the gully. In the moonlight, the stones seemed to glimmer faintly, as though catching light from a fire I couldn't see. Something was stirring beneath this land, and whatever it wasn't content to stay buried. The days that followed were a restless blur. The woman, whose name I had learned was Naya, became quieter still, retreating inward like a cornered animal. But I knew she wasn't just scared of ghosts or ancient curses. There was something else. A weight she carried that no words could ease. The whispers beneath the earth grew louder, an echo threading through the cold winds that whipped the valley. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch fragments, a name, a plea, a warning, slipping through the cracks in the silence. It was as if the land itself was trying to tell me something, but in a language I couldn't understand. One evening, a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dying sun. But no, a man, clothed in dust and leather, his horse steady beneath him as he scanned the valley. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, heart pounding in my chest. The man called out, his voice rough but calm. "Thomas Crawford." I answered, wary but curious. He dismounted, approaching with slow, measured steps. His eyes were sharp, dark, and carried the weight of hard years lived on the frontier. "My name's Eli," he said. "I'm a scout. Been sent to find you." "By who?" I asked, tightening my grip on the rifle. "The military," Eli replied. "They've heard about the warriors coming to your place." I nodded. That much was obvious. What I didn't know was what they planned to do once they arrived. Eli's gaze flicked toward the distant ridges where the dust of a larger group was rising. They're moving fast. A cavalry unit, maybe 200 strong. The thought hit me like a fist. 200 soldiers, ready for war. And caught between them, me, Naya, and the warriors I still hadn't fully met. We need to talk, Eli said. Before things get worse. Inside, Naya sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. When I told her about Eli, she didn't flinch, didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. That night, Eli and I sat around the table, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on us. He spoke of rumors, of rogue cavalry units attacking native bands under flags of truce, of escalating tensions that threatened to explode into open conflict. It's not just about your ranch, Eli said grimly. It's about the entire territory. The government wants control, and they won't stop until they get it. I glanced at Naya. Her hands were clenched in her lap, fingers white. I wondered what she was thinking, what fears she kept locked inside. When Eli left the next morning to scout the military's movements, I was left alone with those thoughts. The ranch no longer felt like a refuge. It was a powder keg, and we were the spark. Days turned into weeks as the warriors arrived in force, their numbers swelling with each passing day. They came not just for Naya, but for justice, for retribution against the soldiers who had attacked under false pretenses. Running Bear, Naya's father, arrived with a presence that filled the valley. His eyes held a sorrow deeper than any I'd seen, and a resolve that chilled me to the bone. He spoke to me not as an enemy, but as a man burdened by loss and responsibility. Your kindness to my daughter has not been forgotten, he said. But these are dark times. The peace between our peoples hangs by a thread. We agreed on a solution, a marriage, not just of two souls, but of two worlds. A bond that would stand as a symbol of hope in the face of hatred. The ceremony was simple but profound. Warriors sang songs that echoed through the hills, their voices rising in a haunting harmony. Naya wore wildflowers braided into her hair, and I donned the shirt I'd saved from my days as a marshal, a reminder of the past I was trying to leave behind. As I took her hand, I felt a surge of something I hadn't known in years, hope. But even as we celebrated, the shadow of war loomed. The cavalry drew closer, and the ground beneath us seemed to tremble with the weight of what was to come. I didn't know if we'd survive the storm, but for the first time, I knew we'd face it together. The morning air was cold and sharp, with the kind of clarity that made every sound and shadow feel sharper. I woke early, as always, my mind restless, turning over the reality that was settling around us like the heavy fog that blanketed the valley at dawn. Naya was already awake, standing outside the cabin, her breath visible in the cold air. She was wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, eyes fixed on the distant ridges where the dust of the approaching cavalry still lingered like a bad omen. I joined her silently. Neither of us needed to speak. The weight of what was coming pressed between us like a tangible thing. That day, I moved through the ranch with a tension I hadn't known before. Every noise, every creak in the timber, every animal's restless snort seemed amplified by the knowledge that soldiers were closing in. The men in the camp around the house sharpened weapons, checked horses, and whispered in low voices. The warriors were preparing, their faces set with grim determination. Running Bear called a council beneath the ancient pines that marked the edge of the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of pine and smoke. Around the fire, men and women sat, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The elders spoke in hushed tones, weaving words heavy with history and sorrow. I stood at the edge, feeling the divide between their world and mine. The conversation was about more than tactics. It was about justice, about honor, about the memory of those lost to treachery. I listened as they spoke of promises broken, of families torn apart, and of a future that seemed as fragile as the autumn leaves drifting from the trees. That night, I sat with Naya by the fire. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers cold but steady. We walk a dangerous path, she said quietly, but together we can face what comes. I nodded, feeling a fierce protectiveness rise in me. I had been alone for so long, haunted by ghosts of a past I thought I'd escaped. Now, I had a purpose: to protect the woman who had saved me from my own isolation, and to stand with her people against a tide of injustice. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the camp stirred. Horses neighed, warriors mounted, and the quiet before the storm deepened. I strapped on my rifle and checked my supplies. There was no turning back. The cavalry arrived in the late morning, a rumbling thunder of hooves and dust. Their banners snapped in the wind, and their officers called orders with sharp voices. The soldiers formed ranks on the opposite side of the valley, a stark contrast to the warriors who gathered on our side. The tension between the two groups was palpable, a simmering rage beneath the surface, ready to ignite at any moment. Running Bear rode forward, his face a mask of calm resolve. I followed close behind, heart pounding. The two leaders faced each other across the divide, surrounded by hundreds of armed men. Words were exchanged, formal, heavy with meaning, and fraught with unspoken threats. The soldiers demanded explanations for the gathering of warriors and questioned the presence of hostile forces near military supply routes. Running Bear's response was measured but firm. He spoke of the attacks his people had suffered, of the broken treaties, and of the need for justice rather than bloodshed. I stood beside him, ready to back up his words if things turned violent. The standoff lasted hours, the sun climbing high while neither side gave an inch. Tensions flared with every glance and every movement. I could see the strain in the eyes of the soldiers, the readiness to fight simmering just beneath the surface. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed, a sharp crack that cut through the valley like lightning. Time seemed to slow. Both sides froze, weapons raised, breaths caught in throats. But no one fired again. It was enough to remind everyone how close we were to disaster. Running Bear raised his hand and called for calm. The cavalry commander, a stern man with cold eyes, nodded reluctantly. A fragile peace held, for now. But we all knew it was only a matter of time before the first spark ignited the powder keg. That night, the camp was restless. Fires burned low, and whispers of war floated on the cold air. I lay awake, thinking of the road ahead. Naya slept beside me, her breath even, but I knew the battle inside her mind had only just begun. Tomorrow we would face whatever came, not just as two people, but as symbols of hope and defiance in a world bent on tearing us apart. And in the depths of my heart, I dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could change the course of history. The dawn came slow, hesitating behind the heavy clouds that hung low over the valley. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, mingling with the faint smell of smoke from the campfires that still smoldered in the early light. I rose quietly, careful not to wake Naya. She was still asleep, curled beneath a worn blanket, her breathing steady but shallow. For all the strength she'd shown, the ordeal had taken its toll, not just on her body, but on her spirit. There was a fragility there now, a weariness that even I couldn't chase away. Outside, the camp was already stirring. Warriors moved with purpose, preparing weapons, tending to horses, their faces grim beneath the shadows of their war paint. The air crackled with tension. Every movement was a reminder that peace was hanging by a thread. I made my way to the edge of the clearing, where Running Bear stood looking out over the valley, his profile sharp against the gray sky. I approached quietly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. He didn't turn immediately, as if lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. Tomorrow, the council will decide our next move. Some want to push forward, to confront the soldiers before they have a chance to strike. I nodded slowly. And others fear the cost. They want to negotiate, to find a way to avoid bloodshed. The balance between those factions was fragile. I could feel the tension radiating from the circle of elders who had gathered around the fire earlier, their faces etched with lines of worry and anger. "You?" Running Bear asked, his eyes finally meeting mine. I hesitated. I want peace. But I'm prepared to fight if that's what it takes. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then you understand the stakes. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Warriors practiced maneuvers, and scouts returned with reports of the cavalry's movements. The soldiers had set up camp just beyond the ridge, their numbers swelling as reinforcements arrived. I spent hours walking the perimeter of the ranch, checking the defenses we'd hastily put in place. The thought of battle made my hands clench, but I pushed it aside. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something much bigger. Back inside the cabin, Naya was awake when I returned. She met my eyes with a steady gaze, the fierce determination I remembered from the first time I'd found her in the creek. "We can't let this end in blood," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "But if it does, we'll stand together." She nodded, reaching out to take my hand. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost. Hope." I squeezed her hand gently. "And you've given me a reason to fight for it." As night fell, the valley was filled with the sounds of whispered prayers and the soft rustling of leaves. I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the wilderness, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Then came the sound, a distant horn, blowing through the darkness. It was a call to arms. The camp erupted into motion. Warriors mounted their horses, faces set with grim resolve. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, feeling the cold bite at my skin. Running Bear approached, his eyes burning with a fierce light. "It's time," he said. The night was alive with movement as the two forces prepared to meet on the field of battle. But as we rode toward the ridge, something unexpected happened. A group of soldiers broke from the main camp, carrying a white flag. They approached cautiously, led by an officer whose face was unreadable in the firelight. "We come to parley," the officer called out. The tension eased slightly, but suspicion hung thick in the air. Running Bear dismounted and stepped forward to meet them. I followed closely, heart pounding. The officer spoke of peace talks, of the need to find a solution before more blood was spilled. He said the military did not want war, only order. But as the talks went on, it became clear there were factions on both sides who did not want peace. Hardliners who saw violence as the only answer. The fragile hope we had nurtured began to crack. As dawn approached, the talks broke down. Words turned to threats, and the threat of war grew heavier than ever. That night, I sat by the fire with Naya, both of us lost in thought. "We stand on the edge of a knife," I said quietly. She nodded. "And we must be ready to fall, or to save each other." The battle was coming, whether we wanted it or not. The dawn broke slowly, as if reluctant to light a day destined to be marked by violence. The valley lay beneath a heavy sky, clouded and gray, mirroring the mood that had settled deep in my bones. The calm before the storm, that cruel, deceptive stillness that presses down on your chest like a weight. I stepped outside the cabin and felt the chill bite at my skin. The earth beneath my boots was damp and soft from the night's fog, and the distant sound of horses shifting in their stalls echoed faintly through the quiet morning. Naya stood nearby, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert and unyielding despite the exhaustion shadowing her face. We had barely slept. The collapse of negotiations the night before left everyone raw and unsteady. The warriors' faces bore the harsh lines of frustration and determination. For many, this fight was not just for survival but for justice, for the memory of those who had been lost, slaughtered beneath broken promises and unheeded treaties. The sun crept higher, and the valley began to stir with the preparations for what we all knew was inevitable. I moved among the warriors, checking their gear and offering what words of encouragement I could. Some nodded grimly, others avoided my gaze. I was an outsider in many ways, a white man wrapped in the traditions of a people who had every right to hate me, yet here I stood, bound by promises and honor to stand with them. Running Bear's presence was like the anchor in the storm. His steady leadership kept the tension from spilling over into chaos, even as whispers of fear and anger spread like wildfire. I watched him speak quietly with his advisors, every line on his face etched with the years of hardship and the heavy burden of command. As the sun reached its zenith, the cavalry advanced from their encampment. A column of dust and steel cutting through the landscape like a scar. The soldiers rode with cold precision, their numbers overwhelming, hundreds strong, armed to the teeth, faces hardened by years of discipline and war. We formed ranks on the opposite side of the valley. Our warriors, mounted and ready, faces painted and weapons at hand, stood shoulder to shoulder with me, the unlikely white man caught in the middle of a storm that felt as old as the land itself. The silence stretched taut between us, broken only by the occasional snort of a horse or the creak of leather. I felt the rifle's weight in my hands, heavy but familiar. The memories of past battles flickered through my mind, moments of fear, regret, and resolve. I pushed them aside. This was not just a fight for me, but for Naya, for her people, and perhaps for something greater, a chance for peace, however fragile. Then, as if the valley itself held its breath, the first shots rang out. Chaos exploded. Horses reared, warriors shouted war cries that tore through the air like thunder. The soldiers responded with a hail of bullets, the sharp cracks echoing off the canyon walls. I found myself in the thick of it, riding alongside Running Bear, dodging arrows and rifle fire alike. The earth shook beneath the pounding hooves as the two forces collided. The battle was brutal and unrelenting. Men fell around me, screams mixing with the roar of gunfire and the clash of steel. I saw Naya's face, fierce and determined, as she urged her horse forward, her bow singing death to any who dared approach. I fought with everything I had, the rifle steady in my grip, even as my heart pounded with fear and desperation. Hours passed like minutes, the sun climbing higher before finally dipping low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the bloodied ground. When the fighting ceased, the valley was silent but for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. The cost was staggering. I dismounted, knees trembling as I surveyed the devastation. Warriors lay scattered, some breathing shallowly, others gone forever. Soldiers, too, were strewn across the field, their ranks broken and weary. Running Bear approached, his face grave but resolute. He clasped my shoulder, his eyes searching mine. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly. I nodded, swallowing hard. The fight for justice, for survival, was far from over. That night, we tended the wounded under a sky heavy with stars, the cold seeping into our bones. I sat beside Naya, who leaned against me, exhaustion finally catching up. "We survived," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I replied. "But at what cost?" Her eyes met mine, fierce despite the pain. "The cost of peace is never small. But it is worth fighting for." As the firelight danced across her face, I realized that this battle, brutal, heartbreaking and uncertain, was the crucible that would forge our future. And together, we would face whatever came next. The morning after the battle dawned cold and unforgiving. The valley, once a cradle of life and quietude, was now a somber tableau painted in the dull reds and browns of blood-soaked earth and crushed foliage. The acrid scent of smoke lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of sweat and iron. I stepped outside the cabin, my boots crunching over frost-hardened soil, every breath crystallizing in the chill. The sun struggled to push through the thick veil of clouds, casting a grayish light over the scene of devastation. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant cries of wounded animals and the low murmurs of the surviving warriors as they tended to the injured and gathered the dead. The night's carnage had left scars not only on the land but deep within every soul present, mine included. Running Bear stood near the edge of the clearing, his tall frame rigid as he surveyed the aftermath. The weight of leadership pressed visibly upon him, his dark eyes reflecting a storm of grief, anger, and resolve. We spoke little as I joined him, the gravity of what we had endured silencing most words. "Many lost today," he finally said, voice steady but heavy. "But we sent a message that will echo far beyond these mountains." I nodded, swallowing the bitter lump that rose in my throat. "Their forces will not forget this. Nor will ours." The question hung unspoken between us. What came next? Would there be retribution? Retaliation? Or the fragile hope of peace? Our fragile alliance was being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. The battle, brutal and chaotic, had brought us closer but had also widened the gulf between our peoples. Old wounds had been reopened, new fears were being sown. Back at the cabin, I found Naya sitting quietly by the fire, tending a makeshift bandage on a young warrior's arm. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across her face, which bore the marks of exhaustion and quiet determination. She looked up as I entered, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of relief and concern. "We must prepare," she said simply. "More will come. The soldiers will not forget their losses. And the government will send reinforcements." Her words settled over me like a cold shroud, but beneath them was a fierce determination that matched my own. Days passed in a haze of feverish activity. We fortified the ranch, stockpiled supplies, and gathered allies from nearby bands who had heard of our stand. The valley became a hub of defiance, a beacon for those who refused to bow to oppression. Yet, amid the struggle, moments of unexpected grace shone through. Naya and I spent quiet hours together, sharing stories and dreams, fragile threads weaving a new tapestry from the remnants of old pain. She spoke of her childhood, the laughter and songs that once filled her people's camps, before the world turned to fire and blood. I shared fragments of my own story, the fall from grace, the scars of betrayal, and the slow path toward redemption. Our bond deepened, not just as partners in this fight, but as kindred spirits seeking healing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western ridges, we stood together atop a small hill overlooking the valley. The air was thick with the scent of pine and impending snow. "I never thought I'd find hope again," I admitted quietly. She smiled, the warmth in her eyes a balm to my soul. "Sometimes, hope finds us in the darkest places." But even as we embraced that fragile light, shadows loomed. A rider appeared at the edge of the valley, dust trailing behind him like a banner. He brought urgent news. The government was mobilizing a massive force to crush the resistance. The final reckoning was approaching. I looked at Running Bear, then at Naya, the two anchors in this tempest. "We must stand together," I said firmly. "For our people. For our future." The road ahead was fraught with peril, but surrender was not an option. As night fell, I found myself staring into the fire, the flames reflecting the fierce resolve burning within me. The fight for justice, for peace, was far from over, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were a relentless test of endurance and willpower. Our small valley, once a refuge of solitude and quiet, had transformed into a fortress under siege, surrounded by the looming presence of the government's forces, a cold and calculated army bent on crushing any resistance. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of challenges, supply lines strained thin, the bitter chill creeping deeper into our bones, and the constant threat of attack hanging over us like a storm cloud ready to break. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Warriors moved purposefully, patching wounds, reinforcing barricades, and sharing whispered prayers and plans. Running Bear was tireless, his presence both commanding and reassuring, a pillar of strength amid uncertainty. Naya had grown quieter, her fiery spirit tempered by the weight of what we faced. Yet in her eyes, I still saw that fierce light of determination that refused to be snuffed out. One evening, as the wind howled outside, I found her staring out the window, the flickering firelight illuminating the contours of her face. The silence between us was heavy, words unnecessary as we both contemplated the unknown future. The siege tightened its grip, the government forces cutting off any chance of escape or reinforcement. We were trapped, forced to rely on our wits, our courage, and the bonds we had forged. Days blurred together, the sounds of distant drums and the occasional crack of gunfire a constant reminder of the precariousness of our existence. Then, under the cover of darkness, a messenger arrived from a nearby band, bringing news that breathed a spark of hope into our beleaguered group. Reinforcements were coming, warriors who had not forgotten the blood spilled in this valley, ready to fight alongside us. The knowledge was a balm to our spirits, a reminder that we were not alone in this fight. But the government was not idle. Scouts prowled the hills, searching for weaknesses, and a palpable sense of urgency settled over their camp. The final confrontation was imminent. In the quiet moments between planning and preparation, I found myself reflecting on the path that had led me here. from a man broken by past failures to a leader standing on the front lines of a fight for justice and survival. Naya's presence had been a catalyst for my own healing, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, life could take root and flourish. As the sun rose on what would be our last day under siege, the valley held its breath. We stood united, warriors and settlers alike, bound by a shared purpose and the unyielding hope that justice would prevail. And when the first wave of enemy riders thundered across the valley floor, we met them not with fear but with fierce, unrelenting defiance. The battle for our future had begun. The valley was alive with a tension so thick it pressed against my chest like a physical weight. The siege had stretched us thin, every moment a test of endurance, every breath a reminder of the precariousness of our fragile hold on this land. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by an enemy determined to extinguish the flame of resistance before it could spread beyond the mountains. But in the midst of despair, hope had begun to stir. The arrival of reinforcements from neighboring bands had shifted the balance. Word spread quickly through our ranks, warriors who had come not just to fight, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with us, their hearts burning with the same resolve. The fierce loyalty of those who refused to be broken became the backbone of our defense. Running Bear moved among them with quiet authority, his eyes sharp, his words few but full of meaning. He had long been the embodiment of our people's resilience, and now, as our forces swelled, his presence inspired a fire that no siege could smother. Naya stood by my side, the quiet strength she carried a steadying force amidst the chaos. The nights were colder now, the wind cutting through even the thickest clothing, but her warmth was a balm against the creeping chill. She had become more than a companion. She was a partner in every sense, the anchor in the storm that had become my life. The soldiers beyond our lines intensified their efforts, probing our defenses with skirmishes that tested our resolve and our wounds alike. Their numbers were overwhelming, their weapons deadly, but we fought with the ferocity born of desperation and hope. On the 7th day of the siege, a storm rolled in. Dark clouds blotted out the sky, thunder rumbling across the mountains, lightning flashing like the fury of the gods. The rain began as a drizzle, then a downpour, turning the valley floor to mud and testing the limits of man and beast. It was on that stormy morning that we received word of a possible negotiation, emissaries from the government seeking parley. The possibility stirred conflicting emotions in me, relief at a chance to avoid further bloodshed, suspicion born from years of betrayal and broken promises. Running Bear convened a council beneath the shelter of the great pines. The warriors gathered, faces grim, their voices low and serious. The offer was simple: surrender and lay down arms in exchange for leniency and reparations. But none of us believed the government's promises held weight. The scars of broken treaties and massacres ran deep in our people's memory. Trust had been shattered, replaced by cycles of violence and oppression. I looked around the circle, catching the eyes of those who had lost family, friends, and home to the same cold machinery of power now demanding our submission. We could not surrender, not without sacrificing everything we fought for. The decision was unanimous. We would fight, not just to survive, but to ensure a future where our children could live free and unafraid. The rain fell harder, soaking us to the bone, but it could not extinguish the fire in our hearts. That night, as thunder shook the earth, I sat beside Naya, our fingers intertwined, the small warmth between us a fragile beacon in the storm. "We stand at the edge of something new," I said quietly. She nodded, her gaze steady. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The final battle loomed on the horizon, a tempest of steel and blood, hope and despair. And when the sun rose the next day, it would rise on a valley forever changed. The dawn broke cold and gray, the valley still trembling from the remnants of last night's storm. The mud beneath my boots clung stubbornly as I moved through the encampment, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken fears. Every face I passed bore the same determined expression, worn by exhaustion but unyielding in spirit. This was the day that would decide everything. Running Bear gathered us at the clearing near the river, his voice steady and resonant despite the weight of what lay ahead. His words were not of doom but of hope and courage, a call to arms that transcended pain and history. The warriors around me tightened their grips on weapons weathered by countless battles. Their eyes met mine, reflecting the same fierce resolve that had drawn me into this fight. Not just as a man seeking redemption, but as a partner in a cause much greater than myself. Naya stood close. Her presence, a quiet fortress amid the storm. The past weeks had changed her too. No longer just a survivor but a leader among her people, a symbol of resilience and grace. As we prepared for the inevitable clash, time seemed to slow. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum, each breath a prayer. The enemy's forces had grown, their numbers now rivaling our own. But they lacked what we possessed. The unity forged in shared struggle, the conviction of those fighting not for conquest but for survival and justice. When the first rider appeared over the ridge, a signal flare trailing fire into the morning sky, a hush fell over our ranks. The battle was upon us. The valley erupted in chaos. The sound of hooves thundered like a tempest, dust and mud swirling beneath the charge. Arrows hissed through the air, met by the clash of steel and cries of defiance. The ground shook beneath our feet as warriors from both sides collided with brutal force. I fought with everything I had, every move fueled by the memory of loss and the hope for a new beginning. Around me, allies and foes alike fell, the line between life and death blurred in the maelstrom of battle. Through the fray, I caught sight of Running Bear rallying his men with unwavering courage. His presence was a beacon, his voice cutting through the din like a clarion call. Naya fought fiercely as well, her eyes burning with fierce determination. I found moments between the chaos to exchange a glance with her, a silent promise that no matter what happened, we would face it together. Hours stretched into an eternity as the battle waged on, neither side yielding. The sun climbed high, scorching and relentless, yet the fight showed no sign of abating. Then, as exhaustion threatened to consume us, a turning point arrived. Reinforcements we had not dared to hope for emerged from the mountain passes, warriors from distant bands who had answered our call, their war cries joining ours in a thunderous roar. The tide shifted. The enemy faltered under the renewed onslaught, their ranks breaking as we pressed forward with renewed vigor. By evening, the valley was quiet once more. The price of victory was etched into every scar, every loss. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, I stood beside Naya and Running Bear, the weight of what we had endured settling upon us. We had won this battle, but the road ahead remained uncertain. Yet, in that moment, hope blossomed, fragile but fierce, a testament to the power of unity and the promise of a future forged together. The valley lay hushed beneath a sky softened by the gentle glow of dawn. The battle had passed, but its echoes lingered in the air, scars etched deep into the earth and into the hearts of every soul who had fought to defend what they held dear. I stood on the ridge overlooking the land that had been both our sanctuary and our battleground. The morning light spilled over the mountains, casting long shadows and igniting the wildflowers that stubbornly bloomed amidst the battered ground. It was a landscape marked by pain and resilience, much like the people who called it home. Running Bear was beside me, his face weathered but serene. His eyes held a quiet pride, not in victory alone, but in the promise that had been born from hardship. The fierce pride of a leader who carried the weight of his people's past and the hope for their future. Naya stood slightly behind us, her gaze steady and strong. The trials she had endured were etched into her very being, yet she moved with a grace that spoke of renewal and determination. She was no longer the frightened girl I had found half drowned in the creek. She was a woman reborn, a bridge between worlds. The days after the battle were filled with work and healing. Wounds, both visible and invisible, demanded attention. But alongside the pain was a palpable sense of transformation. The siege had forged bonds that could not be broken, between us, between our peoples, and between the past and the future. I thought often about the life I had left behind, the solitude I had sought to escape my own failures, the shadows that had chased me across states and years. Here, in this rugged land, among these remarkable people, I found a kind of redemption I had never imagined possible. The marriage ceremony that united Naya and me had not only been a union of two souls but a symbol of a deeper reconciliation, a promise that the chasm between cultures could be bridged by understanding, respect, and shared purpose. That day, surrounded by warriors and settlers alike, we had vowed to walk forward together, not as enemies, but as partners in the creation of a new legacy. It was a commitment that demanded courage, patience, and faith. As the seasons turned, the valley healed. The stories of our struggle and survival spread, becoming legends whispered around campfires and told to wide-eyed children dreaming of a better tomorrow. There were challenges still, prejudice that lingered in the shadows, old wounds that reopened, and the ever-present uncertainty of the future. But we faced them united, each day a testament to the power of resilience and hope. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the aspens and the stars blanketed the night sky, I would find Naya's hand in mine and feel the steady beat of a life rebuilt. Not perfect, but real and full. The path had been long and fraught with peril, but it had led me here, to a place where healing was possible, where the ghosts of the past no longer held sway, and where the promise of peace was not just a dream, but a living, breathing reality. And as the first snow of winter fell softly upon our valley, blanketing the land in white, I knew that no matter what storms lay ahead, we would face them together. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are not those fought with weapons, but those waged within ourselves, and those are the battles that shape the soul. This is our story. A story of loss and love, of pain and hope, of two worlds finding harmony in the unlikeliest of places. And as the firelight dances against the walls of our home, I dare to believe that the future holds not just survival, but a chance to truly live. If you were in his shoes, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay strong and keep believing in the power of hope.